It's Wednesday, June 18th, and it's 4:20 somewhere in the world. I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville. Produced and distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C., this is your NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, artists, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, stash.norml.org. and continue the education and conversation on our blog as well. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. The podcasting and blogging technology for the NORML Daily Audio Stash is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. Visit www.redaphid.com. Welcome to the Daily Audio Stash for this Hemp Day, Hump Day. Hey, Stashers, we had a good time today. NORML's Deputy Director, Paul Armentano, was a guest on the Dr. Drew Show on the Westwood One Radio Network, and his interview followed an interview with the drug czar, John Walters, who was on the show to promote all that more potent, this ain't your father's Woodstock weed scaremongering they've been using lately. Unfortunately, when Paul was on the show, he was unable to hear John Walters' part of the interview, so he wasn't able to rebut John Walters point by point. But as luck would have it, they had a call-in segment right after that, and I was able to get in on the call-in segment and rebut a few of those points. So I'm going to kind of give you a rundown of what happened in the interview. Unfortunately, of course, I can't play it for you because it's copyrighted property. But I'll give you a rundown of what happened in the interview and what some of our points were that two NORML people were able to rebut the drug czar today on live national radio. Also, of course, we've got our Cannabis Science Day and our interview with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine's going to take a look at a new study that he's come out with now that shows the teen use of marijuana is down in the medical marijuana states. Again, I guess that message that we were telling the kids was it's a boring old medicine, and now they don't want to use it anymore. And, of course, we've got our musical break. This is a song that we've got today called The Reefer Song by Jerry Chipetta Jr., and we'll enjoy Jerry in that song. And, of course, the hemp headlines of the day. So sit back and relax and grab yourself some giggle stick and enjoy your NORML Daily Audio Stash. Now it's time to take a look at the latest stories about marijuana from news organizations across America and around the world in our NORML Daily Audio Stash, Hemp Headlines. Florida bill targeting marijuana grow houses becomes law. From Fox Gulf Coast. Tallahassee, Florida. Attorney General Bill McCollum announced Tuesday that the Marijuana Growhouse Eradication Act has been signed into law, giving Florida's prosecutors and law enforcement essential tools to combat for-profit growers of marijuana. The new law, sponsored by Senator Steve Ulrich, Republican of Gainesville, and Representative Nick Thompson, Republican of Fort Myers, passed as House Bill 173 during the 2008 legislative session and was signed into law by Governor Charlie Crist Tuesday. The bill was developed because of the increasing number of grow houses operating in the state and violent crime which tend to be associated with these operations. The new law makes it a second-degree felony to grow 25 or more plants, targeting for-profit growers who exploit Florida's previous threshold of 300 plants. The law will also make it a third-degree felony to own a house for the purpose of cultivating, packaging, and distributing marijuana, and a first-degree felony to grow 25 or more plants in a home with children present. Other important aspects of the law will provide substantial benefits to Florida's law enforcement community. Previously, law enforcement around the state were required to store cumbersome grow house equipment in order to preserve it as evidence. To address this growing storage burden, the new law allows a photograph or video recording of equipment used in the cultivation of a marijuana plant to be considered as evidence in the prosecution of the crime. The law will also allow law enforcement to destroy grow house equipment upon the completion of all investigations and provide immunity from any civil liability to law enforcement for the destruction of the grow house equipment. The Marijuana Grow House Eradication Act goes into effect on July 1st. Well then, that should do it. Now nobody in Florida will ever exploit the profit potential of owning a suburban marijuana grow house. Now that it's a second-degree felony, the camouflage of an unassuming suburban home won't be enticing to a commercial grower who can produce enough profit in one crop to buy the house outright. And the marijuana smokers in Florida, now that this law's passed, will curb their demand for fine suburban grow house marijuana. That way, when some of the more timid growers get out of the business, the price won't increase due to supply and demand, and the growers who do remain won't earn an even healthier profit. Certainly, we won't see any unintended consequences of this bill, like perhaps an increase in violence when grow house owners have nothing to lose and decide to shoot their way out of a raid. It's not likely that as competition for grow houses grows that an organized criminal gang finds a way to control that market, and since Florida doesn't have medical marijuana, there couldn't possibly be any patients there growing over 24 plants just to keep themselves alive. Good work, Florida. California Nonviolent Offender Rehabilitation Act. Ethan Nadelman from the Drug Policy Alliance has some news for us. He's been traveling back and forth to California this year working on a ballot initiative that represents the most significant reform of prisons and sentencing in the history of the United States. It's called the Nonviolent Offender Rehabilitation Act, or NORA for short, and they've just heard from the California Secretary of State that it is officially qualified for the ballot. The research shows a substantial majority of Californians really like what's in NORA. It provides a solution to the state's prison overcrowding crisis through a combination of measures that will simultaneously and safely reduce the size of the prison population, provide effective treatment and rehabilitation, reduce recidivism and crime, and save taxpayers billions of dollars. You might also be interested to know that NORA includes a provision that changes the penalty for marijuana possession from a misdemeanor to an infraction, like a traffic ticket. This single change will protect some 40,000 people a year convicted of simple marijuana possession from the serious and lifelong collateral consequences of a criminal record. Wow, and that's basically what we're talking about there is decriminalization for the state of California, joining the 12 other states that treat marijuana possession of personal amounts like a traffic ticket or an infraction. Californians, you'll all have the chance to cast your vote on this, the NORA, the Nonviolent Offender Rehabilitation Act, in this November's election. New York Assembly passes medical marijuana bill. Albany, New York. The New York Assembly passed a bill today that would protect New Yorkers with life-threatening or debilitating conditions from arrest for using medical marijuana when their doctors believe it would be the best treatment option. The bill passed 79 to 48. The bill is similar to the medical marijuana bill the Assembly passed last year. The version passed today was modified to address concerns voiced by members of the Senate, who have until June 23 to pass the bill before the legislature recesses. The bill's sponsor and Assembly Health Committee Chair Richard N. Gottfried said, quote, "Every day that goes by without this sensible, compassionate law is a day in which our most vulnerable citizens must choose between suffering debilitating pain or risking arrest in order to find relief. These patients don't have the luxury of waiting another year for their elected representatives to act. They need the Senate to stand up for them now." End quote. Dr. Kevin Smith, a Saugerties psychiatrist who has been recognized by the state legislature for his work with police forensics, said the bill would change the lives of people like him who have no better pain relief options. Quote, "Unless you or a loved one has experienced it, it's difficult to understand the frustration and helplessness that comes from knowing that relief is readily available but forbidden by law," said Smith, who suffers from a painful genetic defect that causes his immune system to attack his spine and hips as though they were foreign bodies. The debilitating pain forced him to quit practicing medicine. Quote, "Medical marijuana can give me my life back, but right now I am barred by law from using it. This is crazy." End quote. Glenn Amendola, a medically retired New York City police officer from Northport who suffers from chronic pain and a seizure disorder after being injured on the job in 1987, said it makes no sense for the law to prevent him from using medical marijuana when his doctor says it could help. Quote, "As an officer with the New York City Police Department, I swore to uphold state law, and I'll never break that oath," he said. The flip side to that, however, is that our lawmakers owe it to people like me, who live in constant pain, to make sure the law doesn't penalize us for seeking relief. I should have the right to decide for myself, with my doctor, what my best treatment options are. End quote. The Assembly Bill, A 4867B, would allow patients to register with the state to be allowed to grow up to 12 plants and to possess up to 2.5 ounces of their medicine. State-regulated distribution would replace home cultivation when the federal government grants the state permission to do so.
Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death.
Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind.
If the hideous monster Frankenstein came face to face with the monster of marijuana, he would drop dead from fright.
Reefer Madness.
Pushing back, setting the record straight, marijuana potency. Wow, Paul must have struck a nerve with his debunking the other day of the drug czar's potency report. Usually they don't pay any attention to those of us in the drug reform community that call them on some of their reefer madness lies. This time, though, the drug czar's blog is linking to his debunk of the marijuana potency report.
Over the past week, the University of Mississippi's reporting of the highest ever levels of THC in U.S. marijuana has been picked up by hundreds of media outlets, including some in the UK. We are pleased that this important health information is getting into the hands of parents. Hopefully, responsible adults will have critical conversations with young people about the serious health consequences associated with today's pot. Given the wide reach of the report, it's no surprise that pro-marijuana lobbyists whose goals are to legalize drugs in the United States have attempted to counter the research-based evidence about increased marijuana potency.
Did you catch how they did that? Pro-marijuana lobbyists whose goals are to legalize drugs. They always must tie cannabis to drugs, because nobody's that afraid of cannabis. But most everybody fears drugs. Here, let me try. It's no surprise that prohibition-supporting bureaucrats whose goals are to eliminate competition to pharmaceuticals have attempted to propagandize marijuana potency as some sort of health concern. Hey, that's fun.
Here are two main assertions often made by marijuana advocates and why their claims are off the mark. Claim number one. Even by the University of Mississippi's own admission, the average THC in domestically grown marijuana, which comprises the bulk of the U.S. market, is less than 5%, a figure that's remained unchanged for nearly a decade, via the Huffington Post. Not exactly. The domestic samples analyzed in the University of Mississippi's report do not represent what's found in the U.S. market. Domestic samples refer to marijuana plants that were found in the process of being grown and were then eradicated by law enforcement in the U.S. The potency of these domestic specimens is far lower because those specimens are most often taken from immature plants that never reached full cultivation, maturity, for distribution and consumption in the illegal market.
Oh, you're counting domestic as stuff grown in the U.S. before it's harvested. Well, excuse us, our mistake. If we knew that was how you were defining domestic, then we would have pointed out that 98% of your domestic seizures are feral hemp, or ditchweed. You claim that these domestic seizures are averaging 5% THC content, but you also define ditchweed as having virtually no levels of detectable THC. Now, we have no way of knowing how much of your domestic seizures were, in fact, ditchweed, but I'd venture to guess you're not including ditchweed because you're wanting to make a point about consumer marijuana, and nobody is smoking ditchweed. Fair enough. But then you need to explain why you've spent $175 million taxpayer dollars since 1984 to eradicate ditchweed, something you don't count as part of the consumer marijuana problem.
The non-domestic specimens in the report are from actual DEA street or border seizures, which are a different set of specimens from the domestic eradications. These samples more accurately represent the quality of marijuana that's smoked in the U.S. The non-domestic label has been misinterpreted because the origin of the seized marijuana is not known.
So non-domestic, then, is the marijuana that has already been harvested and prepared for consumer sale. You don't really know where any of it actually was grown, whether it was imported or grown here. Why not just call it growing plant seizures and prepared marijuana seizures? Why publish something so easily misinterpreted? And why include the domestic seizures when, by your own admission, they weren't ready for the consumer market? A cynic might conclude this carefully chosen wording was designed to stoke fears about deadly foreign cannabis, so you can seize on xenophobia to bolster the anti-pot case. Not only is it not your father's impotent Woodstock weed, it's not the local weed your uncle still grows in his backyard.
Claim number 2. If and when consumers encounter unusually strong varieties of marijuana, they adjust their use accordingly and smoke less. The research cited in this argument undermines the author's own claim. The almost 20-year-old study found that the effects of marijuana were greater for the high THC doses of marijuana. Even though the 12 experienced users in the study were titrating, they ended up more intoxicated, and that was with marijuana that only had 1.3% versus 2.7% THC. One has to wonder what effects the average 9.6% THC found in today's marijuana would have on a naive user.
How in the world did they get that explanation out of this abstract?
Male subjects, number of 12, with histories of moderate marijuana use smoked ad lib one cigarette containing 0, 1.3, or 2.7 delta-9 THC on separate days. Smoking topography measures revealed smaller puff inhalation volumes and shorter puff duration for the high marijuana dose compared to the low dose.
Which is something we've been pointing out whenever someone claims the harm from marijuana is caused by the smoking of it.
Active marijuana also increased subjective reports of drug effect over placebo, but not dose-dependently. Thus, although subjects adjusted their smoking of cigarettes varying in THC content, dose-related effects of marijuana were obtained on several measures.
So basically what there's telling you here is that the people who smoked the pot, whether it was the 1.3 or the 2.7, got high, and the people who smoked placebo, that was 0% THC, did not. But no matter which pot was smoked, either 1.3 or 2.7, they got equally high. In other words, the opposite of what the ONDCP is trying to make you think that abstract said.
Marijuana, harmless?
Yes, as harmless as the 100% potent legal THC you approve of, Marinol. That's claim number 3, which for some reason you don't address. Now, we can argue about marijuana's THC content, 5%, 10%, whatever, but that presumes we accept your premise that more potent marijuana is more harmful, which we can't when you're also telling us that a 100% potent pill is less harmful and medically useful. In fact, many of these fears you stoke about using natural cannabis seem to be heightened when using the bar-coded Marinol. Marinol lacks the cannabidiol, which helps moderate the psychoactive effects of THC, and its oral administration forces the user to wait 30 minutes before they feel the effects. Then, they experience both the THC and another liver-metabolized compound, 11-hydroxy-THC, which is 4 to 5 times more psychoactive than the natural THC alone. That ride lasts 4 to 6 hours. And that's what you consider safer than smoking marijuana that's 1/10 as potent and provides immediate feedback for the user. And let's never forget that you also approve of a very dangerous recreational intoxicant that you can buy at 75% purity in most states and even 90% purity in a couple. One that's been proven to be incredibly unhealthy to the user and very dangerous to society at large. One whose prohibition caused more crime and violence and despair. Until you can explain to me how my smoking a joint of any potency is different than you sipping a Bacardi and Coke, your concern for my health and safety rings hollow.
Hello Hello, I'm Paul Stanford from the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation, or THCF. Medical marijuana is legal in 12 states today, and THCF has medical clinics in 6 of those states. Our physicians help qualified patients obtain an authorization for medical marijuana in their state. Patients are eligible for medical marijuana with a history of either severe chronic pain and or nausea, cancer, AIDS or HIV, hepatitis, glaucoma, seizure disorders like epilepsy, chronic muscle spasms as in multiple sclerosis or asthma, neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's, and gastrointestinal disorders like IBS or Crohn's disease. If you or someone you know has one of these conditions, our doctors will help them obtain a permit for medical marijuana. THCF Medical Clinics has offices in Washington State, Oregon, Colorado, Nevada, Hawaii, and California. Call 1-800-723-0188 or go to the web at www.hemp.org or 1-800-723-0188.
As we do Wednesday on the Daily Audio Stash, we're always joined here for Cannabis Science by Dr. Mitch Earleywine, who's an associate professor of psychology at the State University of New York in Albany. Dr. Earleywine, welcome back to the Stash.
Great to be back.
Hey, I was going through the Google, as it's called, and I noticed a story coming out of Long Island. One of the Long Island papers here mentioned a study that you've published having to do with teen use of marijuana in the states that have passed medical marijuana laws. And of course, you know, the big message here, they always said that if we passed medical marijuana, it would send kids the wrong message. So what kind of message have the kids received from medical marijuana?
In fact, if it translates into use, they're not getting a bad message at all. It looks like every state that has passed medical marijuana laws has either seen a leveling or a small decrease in use of cannabis subsequent to the passage of those laws. Some of those states have had these laws enacted, a long time ago, others more recently. California is probably the test case, and it's been 11 years since they've had medical marijuana, and we've actually seen decrease in teen marijuana use in that state. Rodney Skager talks about this in a chapter in my book, Pot Politics, and points out that, in fact, it was very hard for him to get the word out that this was the result after the passage of the medical marijuana laws there. And I think it's intriguing that now that this has been replicated in several other states, to see that any concerns about medical marijuana passing some kind of bad message to teens doesn't seem to be the case, and it actually may be that teens see this as, something that it's for AIDS and cancer and things like that. I don't really want to mess with it. Or they may be more familiar with people who are users who can actually give them a valuable list of what are the pros and cons of use and encourage them to either wait until later in life or to not use cannabis at all.
Well, I'm no social scientist, but I had my own theory on this, and it has to do with, kids being rebellious. They always want to rebel against what their parents do, and once marijuana becomes no longer this hip underground drug, and now it's just, granny's glaucoma medicine, it's not that hip anymore.
It's funny how that whole forbidden fruit aspect seems to be quite the big deal. And so if suddenly you can't show that you're the hip person who disobeys adults in such a dramatic way by using this, maybe that really does take away some of the incentive to go ahead and try.
Do you suppose that maybe teens are affected by any of these, these scary stories that we hear about teenage use and psychosis and the possible, lead to schizophrenia? Let's go over that a little bit and just, is that affecting the kids in any way, you think?
I don't get that impression. Almost invariably, they know users. So they seem to know somebody who uses who isn't psychotic, and so when they hear about these kinds of things, I'm afraid it costs us some credibility as far as, how we talk to them and what they believe. So I'm afraid these little white lies about marijuana making you crazy hurt us down the line if I want to say something like, oh, by the way, methamphetamine can shrink your brain. And even though that's empirically supported, they might say, well, aren't you the guy who told me marijuana makes you schizophrenic? And then we sort of lose their attention.
Sure. And speaking about shrinking the brain, that was another one of these scare stories that just recently came out where they showed that the people who were heavy marijuana users had shrinkage in their hippocampus and amygdala. And what did you have to think about that particular study?
I looked really closely at that, and actually it's extremely well done. They found a very small sample of folks who were extremely heavy users and who didn't use tons and tons of other drugs, which is often no easy feat. But these were guys who smoked 5 joints a day every day for over a decade. I mean, clearly that's going to, have some impact, as, any kind of drug would. And what we're actually looking at is really small decreases in brain areas that are involved in emotion and memory, which we know, cannabis alters. So, yeah, if I, have to say something, don't smoke 5 joints a day every day for 10 years. I'm not sure how many, hundreds of thousands of people should be arrested given those data, but the study was actually really well done and by a team that's very good with that kind of brain structure analyses. But I should mention, too, that, 5 beers a day would be markedly worse for not only the hippocampus and amygdala, but actually the brain ventricles and things like that. So clearly, relative to other illicit drugs, these harms are relatively minor.
Yeah, something that NORML's deputy director, Paul Armentano, pointed out is that every time they do these studies to try to purport these harms from marijuana, it always seems like they're getting the guys that are, stoned all day, every day, massive quantity amounts of cannabis.
Well, as you can imagine, it's really hard to find these effects with anybody else. So somebody who's just getting high on the weekends, even if it has been for a decade, is unlikely to actually show these effects, in part because, the brain is very plastic. The brain adapts, and the brain can make dramatic rebounds, even if there were small, minor effects of using cannabis once in a while.
Another one of the big scare stories, and this one always seems to come across just about every year, the ONDCP releases their Potency Monitoring Project report, and this year they say, marijuana's twice as bad. It was 4% in the 80s and 9% now, which I guess is a good thing because they're not saying it's, 20 times or 400 times as bad like I've heard in some other stories. But how does marijuana's potency affect the user in any way?
This is comic because the late John Morgan pointed out that in the 1970s they were already talking about marijuana being markedly stronger. In the early 1980s, Peggy Mann published a book suggesting that marijuana had increased 100 times, which I guess it would be all pure THC now or something. I mean, it's just clearly an overestimate. This new data, however, is extremely accurate. I really trust El Soli and the group down there who does these analyses. What's curious about this, though, is that they're getting more and more of the, shall we say, international crop, and that seems to selectively weighted into the computation of the average. So I do not really think that the average person is getting 9% THC in his or her cannabis purchased throughout the United States. But then the tacit assumption is, oh yeah, stronger pot, more dangerous, ooh. And, I mean, I can understand if you're accustomed to, seeing somebody down a big bottle of whiskey versus just drinking a beer, that maybe you would think, oh, more potent, more dangerous. As, Tashkin's lab and a few other folks have shown, James Zagney in particular, people tend to moderate how big a puff they take and how long they hold the inhalation, depending upon the strength of the cannabis. And this research was done with cannabis that was 2% and 4% THC. I'm quite optimistic that folks who are inhaling 9% THC cannabis definitely moderate their dose and often brag that this is one-hit pot, that this is not the kind of thing where you have to use as much. And so, of course, although we know, cannabis doesn't cause lung cancer, there are respiratory irritants in smoke, and you're going to be exposed to markedly fewer of them by using this strong cannabis. And, obviously I would encourage everybody to vaporize instead, but again, this doesn't seem to be the big horror story that some folks have sort of implied.
Yeah, and we also find with potency that the iron law of prohibition kicks in, that, a prohibited product always becomes stronger as the bootleggers, it happened back in the 20s, as the bootleggers try to promote that product, and users that don't know what they're getting tend to want to go for the stronger varieties. They've shown those studies of the smokers in Amsterdam who tend to prefer the more moderate varieties of cannabis.
It's funny, too, because back in Prohibition, when my grandmother was running various things to help people out and getting their alcohol, you did find that it was ease of transport that was the big issue. So you could get, whiskey across much easier than a comparable amount of alcohol and beer simply because it was a smaller volume. And we do see this kind of same reaction to cannabis under the situations that we're in with Prohibition. I would be curious to see if not only could we see people cultivate out in the open and take advantage of the idea that you don't need the strongest product in order to have the best one, But also, a lot of times we're seeing folks report, oh, this is really strong, but they don't have any real measure of the THC, and there may be other cannabinoids in there contributing to certain effects. The medicinal effects seem to be related to cannabidiol as well as THC. So we've got a big opportunity here to look at a really complex plant that does all kinds of wild things to the body, and yet we don't get that opportunity simply because of current prohibitions.
Yeah, I often imagine the day when prohibition is ended and marijuana is legally taxed and regulated, and how nice it would be to be able to get some consumer marijuana, and right there on the package maybe it would have the percentage listings of THC and cannabidiol and all of these other components of the plant. It'd be a very nice system to live under for sure.
Well, and then the fun of that opportunity is it's easier to add age restrictions, to gain, tax and regulated funds, and really make good use of that money to increase public awareness about any negative health consequences and encourage folks to come in for treatment if they feel like they're using maladaptively, and let others just enjoy it as they wish.
Well, Doctor, one last thing here. You had sent me this little bit from one of your students, and I thought this was quite interesting on how people perceive how pot is going to affect them may actually affect them when they have tests on their use of pot.
This was an intriguing study, and I'm really pleased with my student Allison Luby. She's done a great job on this. But basically, we had folks who'd smoked many times in their lives come into the lab, and they read a little paragraph saying either, oh, by the way, marijuana makes you really bad at these tasks, or by the way, marijuana doesn't have any effect on these tasks. And the men did basically just as they were told. If they were told, hey, this is going to impede your performance, sure enough, they did worse than if they had read the paragraph saying marijuana doesn't have any effect. Which makes me think that in some ways this sort of stereotype threat about cannabis and cognitive performance may be the source of at least some of these effects we see in the literature about, oh, marijuana messes up your performance on neuropsychological tasks. The funny part is that the women did the exact opposite. And I think for women, being a cannabis user may be you're more in the rarity, and you really want to combat any stereotypes. So when women read that marijuana was supposed to impede their performance, they actually did better than if they read that marijuana had no impact. And I think the moral there is, hey, don't mess with women who use cannabis.
I get that's a good lesson for any time, I believe. All right. Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Earlywine, for joining us again here on the Daily Audio Stash with all the news about the cannabis science that we can use here.
Splendid being on the show.
All right. Thanks, Mitch.
Cannabis. Pot.
Just say no.
No matter what you call it, it's a huge part of popular culture.
Where'd you learn that, Cheech? Drug school.
You don't need weed school. You just need a copy of the new book, Pot Culture, the A to Z Guide to Stoner Language and Life.
Hey, this is great, man.
Even if you never smoked marijuana.
I never used marijuana. Sorry.
Don't think you smoked marijuana.
I experimented with marijuana a time or two and didn't inhale.
Or you used to smoke marijuana.
I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
Pot Culture by former High Times editor Steve Bloom and Shirley Halperin will answer every question you ever had about marijuana culture.
Has that marijuana made it back up here yet?
Check out Pot Culture, the A to Z Guide to Stoner Language and Life at Amazon.com or visit potculturebook.com today.
Too bad, man. I just stopped smoking yesterday.
Here at the NORML Daily Audio Stash, we work hard to change our nation's marijuana laws through education and discussion. But we also take the time to relax and unwind with an eclectic mix of pod-safe music from many independent artists. We look for music that speaks to the growing truth about cannabis, or music that speaks to broader themes of freedom, liberty, social justice, equality, and protest. To find out more about the artists and download the music you hear on this podcast, just log on to stash.normal.org. And if you'd like to get your music heard by the online cannabis community, just send us an email at stash@normal.org. Welcome to Hump Day, Hemp Day on the Stash. We have many warriors in our cannabis army, and today we meet Jerry Chipetta Jr., who tells it like it is in The Reefer Song. Jerry is a real Renaissance man, and his music transports me back to a time when feel-good music was king and an easygoing love song with a little guitar was the only soundtrack you needed. Jerry calls Naples, Florida home, and that laid-back beach attitude is reflected in his music. A gifted songwriter, Jerry reminds me of Jimmy Buffett or Sammy Johns with a message I can believe in. A line in his lyrics, "Here's a solution to our country's debt. We need to wrap it up and tax it so it's easier to get," should end with a hallelujah. You can hear more of Jerry Chippetta's music on his MySpace page, which you can find by checking out our website at stash.normal.org. You can also download his music from iTunes. This is Jerry Chippetta Jr. with The Reefer Song.
Well, it's a part of life the way it starts at a seed, then it grows and it buds into smokable weed. And I don't really know why I'm writing this song. I think it had to do with those last 4 bombs. So baby, don't pass that to me by, 'cause I feel like getting high tonight with you. Sorry, but I don't drink and drive. Well, I prefer to arrive alive tonight with you. And it's a tough decision, it's a hard fact to take, but I smoke more reefer than the money I make. And when I'm out fishing and they just don't bite, I catch a little buzz and it makes it alright. So baby, don't pass that to me by, 'cause I feel like getting high tonight with you. Lady, it's more than I can take. I smoke more than I make. It's sad, true. And some people say that my memory's getting rotten, but I can't remember nothing I've forgotten. And some people say that I pass it like a snail. At least I know how to inhale. So baby, don't pass that to me by, 'cause I feel like getting high tonight with you. Lady, it's more than I can take. I smoke more than I make. It's sad but true. Solution to our country's debt. We need to wrap it up and tax it so it's easier to get. And it's a tough decision, all these green buds I bake, but I smoke more reefer than the money I make. Yeah, I smoke more reefer than the money I make.
Hi, I'm Rick Steves, and you're enjoying NORML's Daily Audio Stash. Please take a moment right now to support this organization by donating online.
Well, like I said at the beginning of the stash here, Paul Armentano was a guest on the Dr. Drew radio show on the Westwood One radio network, and his appearance followed an appearance by the drug czar, John Walters, who was on to tout those figures again from the Potency Monitoring Project to scare us all that this ain't your father's pod, it's the deadly superweed. You know, that scary story that's been going around. And the only unfortunate part about the interview is that Paul was the second person interviewed, and he wasn't able to hear what the drug czar, John Walters, was saying. And so he wasn't able to rebut those points. And strangely, when they came back from break and it was time for Paul's interview, Dr. Drew didn't address anything that the drug czar had said either to give Paul a chance to rebut it. It was a really strange thing. It was a good interview, but it just went into a strange direction and didn't really call up anything that the drug czar had said. So I want to encourage everyone to go out to our blog at stash.normal.org. I've got a transcript of what the drug czar actually said, and disturbingly enough, some of what Dr. Drew said that agreed with him, and I've posted a pretty thorough debunking of most everything they've said there. So if you're interested in hearing about that interview, of course we can't post it because it's copyrighted, so we can't put the audio out there for you. But you can read the transcript of what was said and my reaction to it, along with some links to documentation and research. So I'll just give you some of the quick highlights here. One of the things the drug czar had to say is that a lot of baby boomers my age are thinking about the marijuana they and their friends were exposed to in the early 80s, where the recorded THC is down in the 2 to 3% maybe. We're talking about approaching on average more than 9%. And then, of course, as you know, varieties that have THC content in the 15, 16, even in the 20s are now available to young people. So, he opened up right out of the gate with the whole drug war scare thing. Dr. Drew went and agreed with him and said that, we're producing a drug that is increasingly powerful and thereby increasingly addictive. What? Who says anything about more THC being more addictive? If that were the case, Marinol would be ultimately addictive, wouldn't it? Dr. Drew also said some weird little quote about there seems to be a very powerful opiate-like effect of marijuana these days in these very high potencies. What is that marijuana? Opium weed? I mean, look, there's always been high-potency marijuana. It's just called hash oil or hash. The drug czar also brought up the drug abuse warning network statistics, where they have more people in the emergency rooms reported there for marijuana, when that's a misleading statistic, since the statistic is just whether or not they have used marijuana, not whether the marijuana caused any problem. And then he also addresses the drug czar comes along with more teens coming in for treatment, again, because they're sentenced to treatment from the drug court because they had marijuana. Dr. Drew had an interesting one here where he says that out of all the people he treats for multiple substances, cocaine, alcohol, and pot, the one they really miss is the pot. It creates sort of a euphoria from the drug that creates a love type reaction. They love the drug. Yeah, and I just had to think, if I was on cocaine, alcohol, or pot, I would probably miss pot because of the three, pot didn't hurt me. When you have positive experiences with the drug and a lack of negative experiences, you might miss having it, sure. Now, the drug czar went on to say that one of his problems that he has is the problem overcoming the false view that marijuana is not a serious drug of abuse, and that, people aren't coming to a consensus that this deadly marijuana is so dangerous. And I just have to think, well, yeah, it's got to be pretty difficult to convince Americans when 100 million Americans have tried it and 14 million of it has smoked in the past month. It must be kind of hard to convince those people that aren't going crazy, that they're going to go crazy, or that aren't having these problems with psychosis, that they're going to have problems with psychosis. It's hard to convince people when they have personal experience with it. Finally, the drug czar has to go on here about the criminal marketing of marijuana and bringing up the Mexican drug war and the border wars and the terrible assassinations going on down there. And he says that there's a problem with people taking seriously the criminal marketing of marijuana. And I say, no. I take very seriously the criminal marketing of marijuana. That's why I'm working so hard to take the criminal part out of the marketing of marijuana. Okay? We wouldn't have the problems with the border drug war in Mexico if the people in America could grow and sell their own marijuana. At the very end of the show, as Dr. Drew's going out to commercial, he just mentions something about teenagers and drugs and how it's he hates the rite of passage idea, because whenever you look at any unwanted outcome, whether it's pregnancy, STDs, or accidents, you'll always find drugs or alcohol. Yeah, but on the other hand, just because people who had bad outcomes use drugs or alcohol doesn't mean that using drugs or alcohol is going to necessarily give you a bad outcome. It's in Latin we call that post hoc ergo propter hoc. So that's kind of the highlights of the drug czar's portion. And again, you can get the full transcript up at our blog at stash.normal.org. Thank you for downloading the NORML Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. We are produced by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. Our executive producer is Alan St. Pierre. Our deputy director is Paul Armentano. Our webmaster is Brian Judy. And web production is provided by Red Aphid Interactive Media. As always, you can catch up on the latest information about marijuana at www.norml.org. And you can interact and download from our Audio Stash blog at stash.norml.org. For everyone here at NORML, I'm your host, Radical Russ Belville, hoping all your harvests are bountiful and your encounters with law enforcement are non-existent. All right, time to round things up with another one of our cannabis quotes. This one comes from Chrissy Hind, the singer from the band The Pretenders. Quote, "Whatever I'm already doing becomes enhanced when I smoke pot. It can also be demotivating because if I'm not doing anything and I smoke a joint, it enhances just sitting in a chair. Then I don't even want to get up to change a record. That might not be a bad thing, but you have to get things done once in a while." End quote. That's right, tokers, you still got to get your work done. And remember that we're always facing a negative stereotype about amotivation, so we have to do an even better job. I'm Radical Russ. Thanks for joining us here on the Daily Audio Stash. We'll see you tomorrow. And until that time, take care of each other, tokers.